So, hi everyone, I'm Daniel Liu. I've been doing Android for almost exactly 2 years now. I joined on my friend's company, Moviata, and we write all travel-related applications. And so my presentation today is going to be about Android Drawable XML. And this is something that I have a particular interest in and been studying for a long time. Now, what I mean by Drawable XML are, there's all sorts of drawables that you can use in your application. And most of them are static images that you include in the Drawable directory. But you can also actually create XML files that you include in the Drawable directory. And there's a lot of interesting and powerful things you can do with that. But first I want to talk about the basic graphical assets that you can get on Android. In my mind, there's 3 basic assets. The first is flat colors, and just alpha, red, green, blue. The second are static images, and I have a few of the standard Android menu images up there. You just include them, they can go in a view background, they can go in an image view. And the third are 9 patches. And I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but I just wanted to mention them. If you don't know, 9 patches are static images that can stretch in a slightly more intelligent way. So a static image would normally just kind of stretch to fill its bounds, whereas a 9 patch allows you to define which part of the image is going to stretch versus which parts are going to stay the same. So those are all well and good, but you can't do all of the graphical things that you want to do on Android with them. There's a lot of things that are simply unattainable with just these assets, and there's a lot of really cool things you can do if you delve into Drawable XML. So one of the things you absolutely can't do without going to XML are things like transformation of drawables. I think the most important one being different states that a drawable can be in. So for example, a button has a normal state, it has a disabled state, it has a pressed state, it has a focused state, and all of these are defined in a Drawable XML. Another thing you can do with them is you can do animation. You can have a single XML be based on what's known as the drawable level and define different graphics to be shown. Another really cool thing with Drawable XML is you can mix multiple drawables into one single drawable. So there's one drawable called a layer list that allows you to just layer drawables on top of each other. But you can pretty much mix and match drawables however you want, as long as you use it in XML. The third big advantage of Drawable XML is it gives you simple shape support. So for things like basic rectangles, circles, or whatever, you can actually do that in XML, and you don't actually even need a graphical asset for it at all. And that, through all of these, I found that it helps me reduce the number of assets you need, especially because people who don't know too much about Drawable XML tend to make these applications where they'll say, well, I need this background for this view, which is 100 pixels high, and I need another background for this view that's 200 pixels high, and another one that fills the entire screen, because they don't realize that with Drawable XML, you can actually define these dynamic backgrounds that will move and fill the space. And all this comes down, kind of a minor point, but you can also reduce the APK size by using this built-in shapes rather than including graphical assets. So I want to just show a quick little demo of something that I cooked up. Let's see here. Apparently I'm clicking the wrong button. Okay, there we go. So this is 2 buttons that I wrote. I'm obviously not a graphics designer because they're pretty hideous. But you can see that you have a selected state, you have a normal state, a selected state, and you can also click on them, and they come up with a different color. Now what's really cool about these 2 buttons here is that they're actually defined entirely in XML. There isn't a single static image involved with them. So what I have here is a button which defines the button XML, and that's actually what's referenced in the image view, such that this defines all the states of it, like when it's pressed, when it's selected. And then I have 3 other XML files that define how this button looks in all of those particular states. All right, let me get back to where it was at. All right, so now I'm just going to go through all the different types of Drawable XML that you can use in your application. I'll make these slides available later, so don't bother trying to write any of this down. I just wanted to have the code examples there in case you were curious how some of these things were made. So starting with, I'm going to start with shapes, because shapes are probably the simplest Drawable XML that you can work with. Shapes just function on their own and render onto the screen. And there are 4 basic shapes you can use: rectangle, oval, line, and ring. And as you can see, it's just a simple matter of defining which particular type of shape you want. and then putting it into whatever view or image view you want. There's a few things you can add to this. Right now it has a solid color black, but you can have that be any color you want. You can add a border around that that's of a different color, and you can even do things like dashed borders, as you can see there. You can also do rounded corners, which is really awesome. I've used that a lot. So you can create the rounded corners, and then you can create rounded corners, borders, whatever. But really my favorite thing about shapes are gradients. And you can actually define gradients inside of the shape. And this is super useful because gradients are very difficult without using a shape drawable. Without a shape drawable, the gradients, you can either make a really big asset file, which then takes up just a huge amount of APK size, and might not look so good when it's squished down. You create a small one that doesn't look good when it's expanded. But with a gradient shape drawable, it'll expand or contract to whatever size you give it. So there's 3 different ways that you can set up the gradient. You can set it up just as linear, and that's what the rectangle or the square on the left is doing. It's just from one to another. You can set it up as radial, where it is a gradient from a single point that expands outwards, and that point can be defined anywhere on the drawable. And then you can have sweep, which is not that useful, but it's nice that it's there. And then also you can define the angle, so you can see that right now it's starting from red and going to blue, but you can define that to go vertically or at a 45-degree angle, whatever you want. So that's the basic shape. Now I'm going to start talking about compound drawables. And basically there's a whole series of drawables that allow you to combine multiple drawables into one. I think the simplest of them is the layer list. And here you have this, again, not very pretty asset. But what I've done is I've combined the rounded corner example with a red square with a black ring inside of it. And basically all the layer list does is takes a series of items and puts them one on top of another. And this can be useful. This is so useful. I use it all the time. I can use it to put just a tiny border on an image. I've used it to overlay a rounded corner asset on top of other images. So you can have a really easy rounded border look on pictures with this. And with the layer list, you either just define items that reference other drawables, or you can define a drawable in line. So you can see that the red square here I have defined in line. And there's one other cool thing about layer lists, which is that you can inset the drawables inside them so that the drawable doesn't have to take up the entire space of the background. So if it weren't for the inset, all of those images up there would be covering each other up. But because I can inset them by a certain amount, they're not. Now for Selector, which probably the one that most people have worked with, because it's essential in order to get a lot of Android functionality. It's another compound drawable, but instead of layering drawables on top of each other, this one selects a particular drawable based on the view state. Now views are given state through the system. You can create your own states if you want, but a lot of views have their own standard states. So the button's kind of the quintessential example. It has a normal state, it has a selected state, it has a pressed state. It also has a disabled state and a disabled focus state, but people don't use that very often. Another good example of this are list views. Whenever you're scrolling through a list view, that selector that comes up is actually a series of states, the background that's created there. And the code is kind of a mess, but pretty much what you want to do is, whenever you deal with selectors, is go into the Android core and grab the selector code, grab the code out of there and then copy it and change the drawables to what your drawables are for the buttons. Because they've pretty much already figured out all the different states that a button can be in. You don't want to kind of just be guessing this out of nowhere. So I take the selector out of core for this. Whenever I work with a list view, I usually take it out of core as well and then just replace the drawable references with my own. There's also level-based drawable XML. I'm going to move out of compound for a bit. All drawables have what's known as a level. And the level is just kind of a generic integer that you can use for whatever you consider. So the best example of that is a progress bar where you set a level somewhere between 0 and whatever you define max progress as being. And with there is a number of drawables that actually react to this level that you give it. So for example, the progress bar is actually built out of a click drawable. So when the drawable is, if you had a max progress of 100, if the level is set to 25, then it'll show only a fourth of the bar. And when it's set to 75, it'll show 75% of the bar. So I've used this a lot of times to show like bar graphs, to have different percentages. Makes it really easy to come up with just a certain amount of drawable to show. And then rotate and scale are pretty self-explanatory too. Just based on the level, they rotate a certain amount, or it either grows or shrinks depending on how you set it up. And there's one more type of level-based drawable, which is a level list. And this is another compound drawable, a lot like layer list and selector, but instead of selection based on state, it's selection based on the level. And so probably the best example of that is the battery meter. And this is the battery meter is actually just a whole bunch of drawables that they include. And you can see here in the code that it's just defining at each level of battery, which asset to show. There's also animations that you can do with drawables. So one of them is transition drawable, and that basically just transitions from one drawable to another. The effects of that could be kind of weird if you included like a bitmap transitioning to a gradient or something like that. But typically it's just used for backgrounds. For example, this is a list view, and you can see that this is just taken from the contacts application. And usually on a list view, if it has a context menu, if you click and hold, it'll change that background from one color to another. And that's what a transition drawable does. And the animation list is basically exactly the same, is a lot like the level list. It's another one where you just list out a series of drawables, and it just animates from one drawable to the next with a certain amount of time. So again, the battery charging animation that you see is based on that level animation list. I also wanted to mention that you can reference bitmaps and 9 patches in XML. And this is kind of pointless initially if you think about it, because you can already reference the static images drawables without including them in XML. But what they give you, and you have to look at the documentation for the kind of the details on this, it lets you kind of adjust how these are rendered. So for example, on bitmaps, it lets you enable or disable dithering on the bitmap. But one of the really cool things that it does give you is you can tile the bitmap. And I use this to do backgrounds a lot, where I'll come up with a particular tileable background, and then you can just have it repeat. And it's very easy to set this up in code. I wanted to mention, those are the main drawable XMLs. Here's 3 others that I kind of wanted to mention just so you know that they're out there, but they're not necessarily something you're going to use very often. There's the inset drawable, and what that does is the same as what a layer list does, where it insets, basically it says if a view is this large, then I'm going to inset it by, the actual drawable is going to inset by a certain amount. And typically on its own it's not that useful, because you're going to mostly use it with a layer list, which already has a built-in inset functionality. But you can occasionally come up with uses for it, like if you're going to be referencing that drawable from somewhere else. Color is just a flat color. Not that useful, but it's out there. And then there's one last one, animated rotate, which is not actually that well supported. It's not documented by Android, and I probably wouldn't recommend using it, but I thought I'd mention it's out there. For example, the spinning progress bar that you may have used is actually an animated rotate. But given that they don't really support it, I'm always kind of worried that in a future version they might kill support for that.